Thank you for your patience. I'm Amanda Hunt, Assistant Curator at the Studio Museum, and I'm here today in conversation with Dustin Yellin, Touria Glaoui, and Derrick Adams around African perspectives and kind of how that's being explored in the space of the art fair in terms of Armory, but also more largely in terms of institutions and artistic practices and collaborations. And so it makes sense that you all are here with me today. So I just wanted to kind of begin from a space of, in thinking about expanding and being more inclusive in terms of what we show in museums and in art fairs, thinking about the space of African perspectives at the Armory. What are some of the advantages of that? I read a review in ArtNet or Art News yesterday that it was glowing. It said, it was the only thing that was worth going to the fair for. And so what does that do that's positive? Because, I can certainly think of a few reasons that that's incredible, that 14 artists were represented in the space to share diversity of practices and perspectives, but where are some of the problems in terms of perhaps identifying in this way or othering and kind of supporting that logic? So whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I think that, it's very good for the American public to discover, contemporary African art. A lot of them had never been, have never been seen. Even if we were here last year, a lot of people did not make it. So I think in that instance, it kind of like rebalance and give visibility to a lot of artists that didn't have a chance to be on an international platform before. Obviously, the negative about that is that they might not be invited next year to be part of the show. So all those galleries that were invited for the African perspective, had a great opportunity to obviously have visibility, but the galleries, and this is pretty much the case in all the art fairs, are not often invited to participate. And this is also why we created 154. Originally, it was to make sure that a gallerist and galleries exhibitors who were promoting and devoting themselves in showing contemporary African artists and African diasporan artists to be part of those international shows, because they were never invited. So good and maybe bad if they're not invited again.
I mean, definitely, I think that that is the downside of having these very specific installations in the fairs that are curated through like the thing I'm doing at Volta, and also the Focus, is that these galleries who are invited with the artists this time are invited here on a different price scale even, and which has allowed them the opportunity to actually be a part of the fair. And with that price scale is not available for the people who are participating in the fair just as as applicants. And so even if they are able to get in the fair, affording the fair is a different story. And a lot of these artists who are coming from the continent are at galleries, some of them at galleries that are really small, right? Or some of them aren't necessarily with galleries, some of the artists.
Yeah, I mean, and on top of it, when you talk about price, it's true that they had an introduction price, I guess, to this special focus, which was quite, very expensive for an African gallery, even if it was a discounted price. So definitely pricing is, always a problem when it comes to galleries coming from the continent. Often they have to pay for the logistics, of bringing the artwork, from very far. So it adds up in terms of their participation, and because the art, not that is being positioned as affordable, but the truth it is affordable. So galleries has to sell quite a lot of art to be able to make up for the price of the stand. But those are also their investment in terms of a gallery to be part of those shows. And I think they kind of understand also that this is part of the the being part of an art industry. You have to pay to get visibility, that gives you contacts, clients, etc. But it's true that I think, the experience, and this is the feedback we got from all the galleries, participating, at least at the African perspective, is that they sold out, they did very well. They were able to make great contacts, with institutions and collectors that they didn't know before. So at the end, I think, just for that is a great thing.
I just learned a lot.
Yeah, I did too. I did too. Great. I mean, I've heard a lot in the press in general leading up to the fair. There's been quite a few articles about contemporary African art and contemporary African artists. I think there was a article in the Times maybe like 2 weeks ago about contemporary African artists, and I think that it's a long overdue conversation. I just my hopes is with in this conversation that it could be for me. I've heard it numerous times on different years. Like every 5 years, I hear like African contemporary African art like it's new, and there are quite a few contemporary African artists that have been sustaining their practice and are well known within the art community, but not on a global scale. And I think that if we can just keep it up, so that it's not a every now and then type of thing, which I think is really important for 154 and what they're able to do. Because I feel as being a part of the of 154 and showing with them in the fair, I feel like it bridges a lot of gaps between artists who are from the continent and artists who identify with the heritage of being connected to the continent in some way. So I think the conversation is really becoming very broad and very rooted in what is contemporary and what is African and contemporary African in these days and times. And I think that's a really interesting conversation that has a lot of room for a critical discussion. And I think that's why I'm excited about even being a part of it, because again, people ask like why are you in the African art fair? You're not African. But I do identify with the continent as part of my heritage through my bloodline, and just like any person who's from a particular continent or country, when you move, your roots are still there. If you move with willingly or unwillingly, you still have a relationship to that place, and not necessarily on a nationalistic perspective, but just on a genetic place. And I think about it more and deal with DNA, and that's why I'm excited.
No, to expand the conversation,
Yeah.
expand the audience, which I think is kind of an ideal segue into just the nature of the collaboration between Dustin and Toria. How did you start talking? And if you could even just give like a brief overview of 154, which is the fair that you founded for a very specific reason, and yeah, how you just started talking to Dustin. And we had talked about this kind of behind the scenes before. It's a different sense, your fair. It's not the Armory. It's something a bit more family style, and I feel like that's something that at least I'm attracted to in terms of like seeing work and talking about work in the space of a fair.
Yes, I had the chance to be the daughter of an artist myself, and grew up in Morocco, where obviously we don't have institutions or museums or things like that. So I guess my first contact with art was through my dad. He showed me, the artists he liked, he didn't like at the time, and and kind of like maybe later became more of an autodidact, traveling, around Africa for my professional career, and really admiring what I was discovering, on the different trips I was making professionally, in a completely different career. And I was trying to be very conscious about the fact that all those amazing artists I was seeing, locally in Ghana or in South Africa or in Morocco, Tunisia, were amazing and very, very rich in terms of what they were producing. But there was definitely no visibility as soon as I would leave, those countries where I was living. It's like they didn't exist, or they have very little evidence that, they were part of the international art scenes. So, I mean, it seems that I didn't really do research about it, like until I really thought about like putting 154 together. But I was sure that somebody would tell me, what, there's already a fair somewhere in Miami, focusing on African art. It didn't work for some reason, or I didn't think that this was something that, had not happened in Europe or in the US yet, and because it was not my industry, I didn't really, give it a second thought. But when I realized that this was something that, had never happened, I was a bit surprised, and I was like, okay, so if we keep it as it is, we'll be waiting for the international, I guess, art market to give us inclusion to those. Yeah, exactly. So when I, understood that was just a question of, putting it together, then I thought it was, a necessity. It had to be done. It had to be done in one of the capital of Europe or in the U.S., and this is why I took a step to come to New York. And I think that for me the idea was that for some of those artists it was the first time they will be ever shown ever in some kind of a platform or some kind of a museum. So I really wanted to choose a place that would be more than your local art fair where it's just white walls and then you go and you walk for like any of the fairs like Freeze or the Armory where I thought like if it was their first experience, it had to be a unique experience, something where it was a semi fair and a semi kind of like intimacy between the gallerist and the artist and the person discovering those artists. So in London we were able to find this amazing place called Somerset House, which is one of those most iconic buildings of the 19th century in central London. I purposefully did it during Freeze Week, because I knew that the event on its own could not, drag all those collectors or those institutions. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was in town to be able to discover it and not make it a niche, or specialized, fair where, only people interested in Africa would come. But I wanted to have the international collectors, the institutions, the international curators, have a chance to access it. After the success, I guess, of the 2 first years in London, and I guess the curiosity of the audience, I was like, okay, so if we would need to, I guess, accelerate this whole thing, and give visibility to all those artists, where next should we be? We've done Europe, and the next capital, where things happen should be in New York. And then it was a bit about the search of like a unique venue that would get what we do. And we did, try to find something that could match, the Somerset House. And then it was all about Dustin accepting us into the venue because he might tell you now that he hates fairs. So
Tell us more, Dustin.
Well, I was certainly reticent because I don't, I'm not, art fairs aren't exactly where I get my inspiration. So when I first heard about it, I was very reticent. But I think we, at the time, we had been thinking about curating a show of African art here. And I'd like to preface that by saying, this idea of America and Africa makes me sick. I think that's what's holding our species back. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for me even to talk to it and think a show of African art or a show of Indian art or an American artist showing in London. I really think countries are this idea is antiquated and it makes no sense with the way our species relates to our planet. And it's really, the fact that we still think like that inherently holds us back.
Yes.
And so
But it's more being part of more of an ideological way of looking at
storytelling of DNA and storytelling. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But this is a good start.
Yes.
To build bridges.
Yes.
And so we started discussing it, and she was very convincing, and we said, let's give it a try, basically, and we all went back and forth, and we gave it a try, and it actually was phenomenal. It didn't feel like an art fair. It felt more like a very curated exhibition of wonderful souls, and so the vibration during the whole fiasco was so lovely. Now we're doing it again in a couple months. And I still won't think of it like an art fair. I just think of it as a beautiful bridge to bring a bunch of incredible people into this vessel and let their work be exhibited to folks who have never seen it before.
No, it was incredible. As a curator, working at the Studio Museum, I was able to see more from the continent that would have taken me much longer to get to, I think, if I were relying on travel grants or the Dakar Biennial or just occasional moments along the calendar year financially. So Billy Zangara, who's South African, who shows with Afronova, ended up being in my show that's coming down today, A Constellation. I'm making a final plug. I feel like I have to. But her work's incredible, and I don't know any artist working in that way now from any continent if we're going to have to identify these things. So it was actually probably the first instance ever where like that was a productive space, where something came out of it, where it was generative, where it was totally organic in the sense of like, oh my goodness, I see something that speaks to me that I'd like to talk more to this artist about. So I was able to set up a Skype with Billy because her gallery connected us, and it happened very naturally, and it felt hopeful, which I feel like is something that Dustin identified too a little bit. And you, in saying that you needed to find a unique home for it, obviously you too have a unique perspective and kind of like set of concerns, I think, within the space of commercial art and the art world that really is kind of necessary in a lot of these ways. So it's a nice occurrence that they kind of have met.
Well, I think that what's nice about 154 in general is that, as I said, for some of the artists, not for Billy because she's been exhibited before, but it's their first exhibitions, in some of the cases, and a lot of them, thanks to the galleries, actually are paying for the artists to come and be part of the show. So we have the chance to also have a lot of the artists present during the fair, and I think that also adds to the experience of the artist, but also the visitor of 154, because they're able to discuss some different perspective with the artist, and I think in terms of discovering the work for the first time for anyone, I think having the artist present to explain the work is quite a unique experience. I mean I'm very grateful for Dustin and Gabe, and to have accepted to host 154. I think the intimacy of obviously Pioneer Works, the whole idea behind Pioneer Works with residency program, with all those labs that you have, and the bookstore is really what we're trying to develop in our little island of 154, as well. And I think thanks to Gabe and Dustin, we're now able to have, I think, 2 African artists part of the artist residency program as well. So I think, as you said, it's also building bridges, with Africa, and having those artists present working here will be also adding to the experience of those artists, in the future as well.
What are the terms of the residency program, and was that just a natural kind of conversation where Touria and you shared information, and these artists kind of came to you through the residency in this way?
Well, we were just discussing, I think, coherent ways to bridge the 154 and PW during that moment. And so having a couple of the folks who were going to be here exhibiting in our residency program working seemed like a great way to do it, and it had to fit through our curation and the committees, and everybody seemed to get on board and agree. I mean, we all loved Omar's work right from the, so it wasn't pushed. It was just a natural thing and a way to make the one-day thing have more of a duration and have more connective tissue built inside of it. So luckily the curators picked Fabrice and Omar for the residency, which is fantastic. And the residencies are 3 to 6 months and under the same terms of all the other residencies. So it was like a fortuitous moment. It wasn't pushed. It was just like, what about this? Oh, that makes sense. And then the curators, we just kind of put it in front of the curators, and they seem to love it. So
We came like a flock of seagulls. I think that's kind of like a perfect also jump to something else I was thinking about that I was going to say for later in the conversation, but it seems to be coming up now, is this idea of expansion. Like, we've kind of touched on the ways that this has happened naturally, even just within the structure of like the Armory, kind of like thinking about African perspectives, but also you creating 154, which you should talk about the title of, because I think that's quite relevant. And then, just all of these things that beget more opportunities, the residencies, just the conversations with curators, just visibility. But something that we had kind of also touched on earlier was the expense of some of these things. So for those artists who, because there are so many underrepresented artists globally, right? But how can we think about expanding opportunity and expanding audience kind of from this point out? Because I feel like there's a good momentum right now. There's a nice kind of structure for what can be built on further. So what are some of your ideas around that, or things, areas of potential, ways that this could spin out or off?
So For 154, I think we are trying every year to, have something called a special project. There's also, we are a small fair, so there's so much we can do. But I think there's two things, part of the special project where we kind of have an art center from the continent to be part of the fair, where they are the pioneers, and usually the city where they're from, where they are promoting artists, etc. They would definitely do not have the means to come to London or to New York. And the idea is that we are very grateful to what they do on the continent, and we're very aware of how important their role is locally, and for us, for them, to be able to promote, as you say, unrepresented artists, as part of 154, and be able to help them one way or the other to continue or pursue what they do is one way for us to do it. There's also very interesting events on the continent that people usually don't have access to, or as an American, you might not think of going, because Africa is not always, seen as the most safe place to go. But we had chances to, showcase some events. So this year at Pioneer Works, we are showcasing the Biennale of Dakar, which is happening exactly at the same time. So we'll have a projection room showcasing little videos of live events happening in Dakar.
I had no idea. That's wonderful.
Yeah, so I think that's for us a way, for American people to kind of also maybe decide next year or in 2 years to go as well, because they might be excited about what they see through these projections. In New York, in London, we're giving, access to the Addis Abeba Festival, Photo Fest, which also will give light, to this event happening, in Dakar. So we're really trying to collaborate with different city every year, not to have a focus on the city, but try to choose between a number of interesting projects, to give international access to those projects. I think since the beginning, another way of expanding for us was to put the forum in place, which was a series of talks and artist talks and panels of discussions, which were more targeted to the education. And with that, we were able to I don't know, for example, in 2013, we had Hansel Ulrich Brice, doing an artist talk with Otobong, a Nigerian artist, who he then picked up for one of his performances, at Art Basel, So if we're able to provide those type of collaboration where, institutions, international curators, expand their pool of artists, into, including African artists, I think for us will be, reaching, the objective of 154. And to come back to the name, 1 is for the continent, 54 is for the numbers of countries in Africa, which a lot of people don't know. And obviously, we're not trying to say that we'll be covering all the continent, because there's so much to cover, but it gives quite a good glimpse of, diversity, multiplicity, which were always the objective, of the platform, is to bridge that, to bridge that gap, So I think we're doing that through the forum, through the special project, and obviously the gallery is showcasing, the best content, there is on the continent, and from the diaspora as well, because I think part of the only requirement actually 154 has is that we only are open to galleries coming from the world, the whole world, but they only have to present contemporary African artists, or artists from the diaspora, or artists that decided to move their practice on the continent, So this is their platform. Then, they don't have to be specialized in African art, but the booth that they choose to take here will be to showcase those artists.
Derrick, I'm going to pick on you for a second, because you're a practicing artist, you're a performer, you're a lot of things, but you also function as a curator. And you just curated a selection of works within the context of Volta Fair. So I want to see what your ideas are, and kind of, maybe it's not reflected there in terms of African perspectives or disseminating the work in the way that we're trying to talk about today, but your role in that, because you're quite a connector.
Well, I think of myself in my practice is kind of very much right in the middle of thinking about traditional African culture, and more on the kind of more metaphysical level, extending outward, and not necessarily using it as a one-to-one reference, but just trying to communicate this influence of the West African part of the continent with the way I make work and the way that I see myself as a Black American or African American. Either one, both are fine. I have no problem
You're
with.
fluid.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with categories. I just have a problem with people living within the categories. I think that good artists and good philosophers and good people extend beyond categories, but I think people need categories in order to, identify the platform on which people are speaking from. But I was really excited about the possibility of curating a show of grouping of artists at the same time as the Focus Art Fair and presenting contemporary African artists.
Tell us a bit more about it.
When I was invited to put together this exhibition for Volta, the curator section, and showcase 8 artists, I was really considering just the practice each of these artists practice, and how, for me, it was more not trying to directly make a relationship between what was going on in the Focus section of Armory and contemporary African art, but to at least maybe show a certain kind of kinship in the materiality of the way artists worked. These artists, some of them primarily, the artists were of color, most of the artists in the exhibition, but not all. And they range from one artist is living in Cairo, and one artist is from Dominican Republic, and the rest, and most of the artists are American, Black or white. I was just thinking about the way that they were working and how just by innately, I just picked these artists that I thought works to me, operate both in a very American sense and a very African sense in some ways, especially a couple of the artists in the show. I felt like the way that the material they were using and the thing they were referencing in their work, I felt was somehow in conversation what was going on, and in the Focus area, but very uniquely different, that represented more of a conversation about the contemporary American culture and how other things are kind of really interwoven with American culture from different cultures. And that's really pretty much how I see American culture.
And you also talked a lot about the body. Like there was a lot to do with the body in that space. And the title of the section as well was important. Yeah,
the title of the section was called Something I Can Feel.
Which I feel like was political.
Yeah, it was political, yes. It was political, yeah. But it was a phrase that I feel when I'm looking at art, and most people feel like that when they're looking at art. Like, I'm not feeling this, or I'm feeling this, or So I feel like most people have that automatic response when they're thinking about art, and even the most intellectual person still responds to art in the idea of feeling or not feeling things. And it's okay not to feel everything that you look at, and it's okay to have a response to certain things you're looking at. But I was really interested in works that I responded to just as an artist, as a person. And when I was offered the position to curate the show at Volta, it was a great opportunity to showcase some of the artists that I have been in conversation with lately in the past couple of years as artists to artists. I wasn't really in conversation with them as a curator, but just looking at their work as open studios or their studio, with casual meetings mostly, just, going over to someone's studio talking. And so when I was invited to do the show and I wanted to think about a concept around the show, I started thinking about the works that I still remember from the time I saw them and how they kind of resonated to me right now, and how it was about the way I felt looking at the work, and how that has to be a very important part of my engagement with looking at art. And the other things that happen with your engagement of art, what goes more into the detailing of how it was made and why it was made, is something that I still feel like you have to be somehow, it has to be a provocative encounter for you to be interested in those things. And not the other way around. You shouldn't have to look at that labeling part in order to actually situate yourself in the art, but the work can lead you to that part of the art making from the artist's perspective. So I always think of myself in general. I think of my practice as a American Black. I always think that my work is really much an interpretation of my Africanness in popular culture, navigating the popular culture and using, like, I don't have to even think about Africanness when I'm making art. I just know that when I make something that I think is interesting and the rhythm of it is coming from a particular place, I can attach it to something that I think is traditional from the continent, mostly from the West African continent, that I can identify with based on just cultural perspective and material as metaphor.
And the forms,
And the
the
form,
figuration.
And the figuration, and I think those things are very much important to me, and I think that with a fair like 154, you can see like my contemporary spin on what I think about as a Black American of African descent fused with American culture. And you look at my work, you can see those references happening in the work, which both to me brings a new conversation about like appropriation into play and integration, or even progress in a certain way. So I'm interested in those relationships just from just a historical place.
Absolutely. You had talked about artist to artist, kind of just a more casual relationship coming to the studio, and we got a nice chance to be in Dustin's studio before coming together today. So I was wondering about what attracted you to Derrick's work, and how I should disclose now that Derrick will be showing here at Pioneer Works in June. So I'm
excited. Mark your calendar. June's going to be a great show here. Great installation, sculpture, collage, performance at the opening. It's going to be fun.
I mean, a friend of ours, we have a mutual friend who said, "Oh, you got to see Derrick's shit. You got to see his shit." And I was like, "Oh no," because you never know when.
Yeah, you never know. You're like,
your
no,
friend's like,
know.
it's
good, I swear.
You got to see this, and he's on the board, so you even got to do that more. You got to,
Tricky.
no, he's on the board, and he's going to show me this and what. And I kept saying, okay. And then finally, I got around to it, and like Derrick just said, something you can feel. I was like, I want some of that shit. Can we trade horses? I was like, I love it, and it was just, it was that easy. I didn't have to think about it. I walked into the studio because I already liked him, which even worried me more.
Yeah, we talked. I'm always scared when you meet someone, and you say like, I hope I like that work because they're cool, and I don't want.
I don't want to ruin it.
Yeah, if you don't like that work, I mean, I was like, I like you, but I'm not into your work. Exactly. Like, I'll say that. But I was hoping I didn't have to say that, and I didn't have to say it, which is great. But I was also hoping on the other side with Dustin, because we met quite a few times talking. I hung out here. I came to some shows, and then the exhibition came about. And but before that, they came over to my studio.
Yeah, and it was immediately. Yeah, I was like, oh, I really like the guy, but that even scared me more.
And it wasn't for a show. You just came by. We just came by just to check out what I was doing. And then after, like a month later, we talked about doing the show. So it wasn't even like he came over for a studio visit for an exhibition. He just came over just to kick it.
And that's the best way when it's really just like, hey, come, let's hang out in the studio.
I wasn't auditioning or anything for a show.
I think that, at least in my experience of you before meeting you, like, so much of the focus is around what you're building here at Pioneer Works and in Red Hook. But as an artist, and just kind of like being with the work for a moment before coming here, I also heard you say that you want to break down boundaries. You're not into categorizing things. And when I was looking at like the bodies in your work, there's like a very universal kind of something happening there. So I'd love it if you could just like talk a little bit about that too, because
I don't even think of them as humans anymore. I kind of got stuck. I was making something, and then I went to see the Terracotta Warriors, and I was thinking about, the vessel, and how do you trap consciousness and then expand consciousness, and
wow.
And now it was like a 9-year project to make the humans. I'm done. Like, I still have 2 more years to finish the project, but I'm already way done. So I'm building this weird ant farm archaeology of a landfill, sort of like in The Shining, but being like, the Helen of Troy, like under the earth with the garbage kind of maze right now. And I'm then building this weird sort of Boschian, Cornell-esque landscape thing. But the humans, the humans aren't specific people. It's really,
for sure.
It's about, how do you trap your memories? How do you trap your time, your experiences, and freeze those? And so, in fact, I'm not even, figurative art's not even my sort of thing. I just kind of got stuck. And even now, I kind of feel, distant. When I see that work that I'm still making, I'm like, fuck, why am I even making this shit? But it's like if you're building a house.
You got to see it through.
In the desert, and you spend 10 years building a house, and you're finishing the roof, and, you spend a decade, and you're like, fuck, I want to live in the jungle. you gotta still put the roof on,
You gotta finish it,
It's hot.
You gotta finish it.
No, but I think there's just in the space of our conversation, there's a nice kind of duality, just thinking about, the thematic of the body, but also your work, Derrick, and the figuration, the use of, or the exploration, I think of, you're talking about integrating a more historical kind of West African aesthetic and marrying that with an experience maybe of American culture, Black culture, and then Dustin just talking about universal bodily memory experience, opening.
But you can do both.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can talk about culture, and you can talk about really specific culture, and you can also talk about the universality within that very isolated culture that is almost kind of going into again back to the DNA, which can be very defined and personal and singular, but how that singularity cannot really connect with so many other forms outside of that. And I didn't think as much about that until I started traveling more as an artist. And when you go to a country and you go to a museum, I'm always so blown away, and I always appreciate when I see a Joseph Beuys exhibition next to a Keith Haring exhibition. I like to see that, and I like to see, an exhibition of Enoatsui next to another type of artist. I think that every artist that we know historically represents a certain cultural perspective, and also a certain gender perspective in some ways. We talk about it in art school all the time. There's a certain type of art that we see that some white guys make. And we look into and we go see shows, and we like, that's a white guy show. It's not like it's a bad show. We're not saying it's a negative show, but there's a show of a particular thing that usually has to do with an aesthetic that's very similar to Richard Serra, something that's really big and massive and metal, or was marble, or some kind of I'm going to make a huge, gigantic sculpture. That's what we think about in art school. Everyone has a cultural perspective, and we deal with material based on our cultural perspective. And I think in that case, people reflect to the idea of Renaissance and Renaissance sculpture. But for me, as a artist who's Black, most of my inspiration is based on what I'm looking at right now in front of me. Who am I talking to right now? My grandmother, my mother. It's not necessarily about me personally, but tapping into that relatable experience that everyone should have based on a very personal experience with family and culture and people. And it's not saying that it's subject to only one race or person having that, but I think that it's something to be said about cultural perspective as not being better or worse than another one, but very different. And I think that I look forward to that more now that we have global culture. It's becoming so dominant that we're really losing that uniqueness that has to do with people making things in different regions and the material that they're using in different regions as not being identifiable to everyone everywhere. And I think that's something that we need to kind of hold on to more, and not in a way of trying to make it other, but to make it almost like an added part of culture.
Incorporating.
Yeah, incorporating. I think the ultimate goal is to be like Star Trek, where everyone's coming from a different planet, and that we need all these different people from different planets to make up this ship and to learn about these different people. We don't want them to change what they were doing. We don't want him not to be a Cleon. We want him to be able to, or she to be able to understand, to have this conversation. Because when I and as an American, I was talking about this a lot, is that even in America, the way America is structured very much like a European country. They just have small countries, but our states are basically countries. And now with the politics happening in the country, when you travel around the country, you can realize how much we've been operating as countries versus America. And I think that's really interesting of the type of art artists are making in these different places, because their work is very reflective of what's going on, the political climate of that state or that city and the materials. And I think that we should never want to change that. Like, I think it's something to be said about artists making work from the South and what they use from the South, and artists who are making work from upstate in these different places. Those things are just identifiers of cultural representation and what people are thinking about. So I think it's important to have categories, but a good piece of art kind of transcend the platform that they were built on and connect with other people. But I think it's something to be said about that, and that we actually are losing more of that in the art market, because certain models are being set for what is acceptable in the art market and what is not. And I think that if we control it more with the artists, on the artist side, we can kind of really show the idea that, you know, regardless of the cultural perspective of the artist, that we all are kind of aiming for the same goal as an artist. And the main thing is to live off your art, to continue to keep making art and nothing else. That's the goal, you know. So there are markets of people who just want African art, and there's markets of people who don't want any African art. Like, we're also a part of a luxury item market. So there are people looking for different things, and unfortunately, that could be, I mean, fortunately and unfortunately, that could be good for the artist or not. But I think that there is a market for contemporary African art, and or whatever that means to certain people. But I think that's a challenge that we are facing right now, just in general with art. I mean, because right before that, people were talking about contemporary Indian artists. You know, but it's really up to us to kind of continue these categories as things that are not trends.
Right.
Yeah.
So given that you want to kind of hold on, you think that it's important to have cultural perspective, that can be like incorporated. Do you think, and I want to hear from each of you on this, that something like African perspectives, like these kinds of focuses, this kind of conversation can continue? I think we're all kind of on the same page, really, at the end of it, but just curious to see if you think that this is a productive space and conversation for a whole kind of cross cultures, cross narrative, I mean, markets, you know, nonprofits, institutions, all of that. Is it a productive space?
Well, I believe that, you know, the perspective or the focus that, you know, those fairs have on African as a one-off, as a first time in the US is, you know, beneficial for, I think, everyone, because it touches everyone, and obviously it gives access to different artists and give visibility, etc. But I think that we're trying to stay away from the trend, you know, where Africa is like the hip thing to buy right now, and every other fairs want to have a focus for a year. I hope with 154 we are the constant where, you know, the artists will have always a place, you know, to exhibit and, you know, give them visibility. But I always think, and I always say it loud, and you all can you know, hold me to it if it doesn't happen. But I always say that the best death of 154 would be that we don't need 154 anymore. So I do believe that, you know, if you take away those focus, if you take away, you know, this trend, you know, those, you know, percentage of numbers of artists, you know, in those international stage are too little for the moment. So until that, you know, percentage of artists be included in international exhibitions, biennales, art fairs, you know, increases, either due to the fact that those galleries are now accepted to those art fairs, you know, on a general space level, or that exhibitions, you know, include more African artists, then, you know, if we don't need 154 or any other, you know, platform to do such things, you know, they'll be, you know, they will have served their purpose, and that will be it.
Yeah, I think if you just keep, it's like you just keep the lights on. So if you have a big ball of dirt and water, and you're shining light on part of the sphere, and you're gonna see the shit there, and the art, and the people, and the culture, and the humanity. But other parts of it are dark. If you can get the lights on around the entire thing and keep them on, you won't need 154 anymore, and you won't need black and white, and you won't need America and Africa. You'll just have the lights on. So if you can just keep the lights on all the time around the whole ball of shit, so to speak, then you're gonna actually, then you don't need that stuff. And I think these things are sort of the soil that we can till.
That's the hopeful, positive way to think about the world.
But like you were talking about,
I
I don't believe in homogenizing culture. I think it is about storytelling and about DNA and about having these stories that are additive and that create this beautiful diversity.
Yes, exactly. I think that's very important. I think that as we progress as a species, I think it's important to think about difference as almost like a power, and not difference as in being outside of who you are, but actually an added part of
spectrum.
Exactly.
Relativity.
Yeah.
Perspective. Yeah.
Like almost like having someone around you that has a different perspective is actually adding a certain dimensionality to you as a person, as a citizen within your culture. And that the fact that they're not from where you're from, that you have a lot more to learn, which I think is even better as a creative person. I think a lot of my ideas come from my interaction with people on various levels, not just people from my own cultural background, but from beyond. And I think of difference as being unique, but I think of difference as being equally the same. And I look at art, and I look at artists and the way they make work, and I'm really interested in this platform of 154 because there are certain things that, like, I'm aware of certain aspects of African culture as a follower of the culture. But when I come to 154 here, as a viewer, I see what some younger Africans are interested in, because now I'm getting a full spectrum of what global culture in some way has added to perspectives from some of the artists using materials and artists from the continent who are living in like Sweden and living in like different other parts of the world that were born in Africa or lived in Africa, like Audubon, who lives in Holland, yes, who is an amazing artist. You should definitely look at her work. It's mind-blowing.
It really is.
And I met her in the show in Chicago. We were in the show together. And I've never seen her work before, and now that I've seen her work, she called me, she emailed me, she's the Fair 154. We communicate, but I'm learning all these other artists that I would have probably never met. I mean, that was a different instance. I met her outside of that 154, but a lot of the artists who are shown in 154 have not been in any of the art fairs or any of the exhibitions. And the unfortunate side of being an artist of color, a lot of times when you're in a show with non-blacks, you're usually one or two people in the show. And if you're really good, you're going to be the African in the show, in the museum show, or you're going to be the black guy in the show. I'm just saying that's how it is, And so I think that having this conversation about the need for platforming more contemporary African artists will definitely make it more of a norm, that maybe you might not see them in exhibitions as much, but you will see their work featured here front and center, and you'll be aware of who's doing what and from what region they're making the work. And for me, it was an educational experience just connecting in that way.
Yeah. Keep it in the conversation. Yeah. So let's all agree to keep the lights on.
Yeah, keep the lights on.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives.
Thank you guys.
I'd love to open it up if anybody has any questions before we leave the stage. It's Sunday night. Yeah.
Maybe I misheard you, Derrick, but you had an interesting point about when you were talking about market forces and how, I think you said something about how artists could try to maybe have more in a hand in that and control that. Sometimes it seems like the market can be this juggernaut, which is selecting, this work makes sense, and it usually, as you're saying, is in dialogue with minimal practices or, the hit published history, but are there ways you've thought about that certain artists who maybe don't fit that very specific trajectory can, you know, make an impact in the market or reach those people?
I mean, it's really a challenge. I mean, I think for artists more so now, because if you're a younger artist or an artist who's not represented or anything like that, you still, even the fair around the major fair is acknowledgement of the market in some ways and wanting to be a part of the market, even if you're doing like something that's considered like bohemian or it's still like it's still, you know, parasiting off of the structure that's existing, which is totally fine. I mean, I think the goal for most artists is to live off their work. So I think that's the objective, and you have to kind of establish your practice when there's an opportunity to benefit off of those things that are happening and still keep your integrity of your practice. So I think that's the challenge, but I think it's really, artists always have more control than they think they have. You know, and I think artists are always going to be in the forefront as long as they follow, as long as they stay in touch with what's going on around them, not in the market, but what's happening in front of you, like what's happening with the people around you and the things that you're communicating with. The market is just a market, like any other market. And you could make work that you can automatically fit into the market, or you can make work that challenges that concept of what is art and what is in the market. So it really has to do with what battles you want to pick and you want to fight, you know, as an artist. But it's always interesting when artists make organizations make like a sub-fair near a larger fair. I think that's a great idea to do that if you want to tap into that audience, you know, but that's not your audience you want to pick up on. I think that's kind of maybe going the opposite of what you want to do. Maybe you want to do your project when there's not a fair. Maybe it's something else happening. But I think for some artists, who understand what they need to get done and how they need to do it, I think the fair and the market from the fair is very beneficial to some artists to continue, especially artists in places that are isolated. If you sell one or two pieces, it may actually pay for artists like where they live, their family, you know, depending on if they're in a place that's really isolated and there's not a high overhead, that one piece from like 154 could probably supply some artists with a large sum of money to continue to work.
Completely. We had those cases just to, you know, be able to buy more art material, you know, for even the art center or the gallery to continue, you know, to promote the artists in other shows, you know. So I think it's, I mean, for us it was very, very strategic that we did it in satellite to another large fair. I mean, what we wanted international collectors to give, you know, to take an interest. We wanted institutions to take an interest. We're not sure if we're choosing at another particular moment of the year. It's so full of different events, you know, that we would get all those people's attention. I think, you know, we could have done it at a different moment, make it, you know, our own event. But at that point, you know, it was very. It was very, very important to make sure that we could get those people at the fair. So we didn't really think, you know, we needed to be the central event. We were happy to be a satellite event at this point.
I mean, it works. I mean, I think it has to do with understanding who your audience is and who you want to be your audience, you know. And I think that's the bigger thing to get over as an artist, to realize like who you're really communicating with and who you want to support you. And I think that's when you think about yourself in the context of a market and a fair.
First, I want to thank all of you. I think it was an extraordinarily enlightening conversation, and thank you for your efforts. Unfortunately, I missed 154 last year. I'll certainly come this year. But I think one of the important things that you brought out as issues has to do with the international art market and artists maintaining their identity. And I think it's really important to point out that Africa is a very large continent, and in many countries there are artists where there is virtually no local art market. And meaning. I mean, for example, in South Africa, many artists were very political during the time of apartheid. Their work was really, really powerful, and then it continues to be so, but there is a very vibrant market. You don't need an international community, whereas you take Mali, it's very difficult for somebody who wants to confront the issues that are current for them to do so without becoming part of the global art market. And being in for example, in India, you mentioned India, there's a very, very strong tradition of Indian art. There's a strong Indian art community. And there are collectors, most of whom collect Indian art. But that doesn't exist throughout Africa. And I think one of the important developments that I've seen, that's probably like yours, is that at Venice, in the Biennale, the number of countries that have supported, African countries that have supported the pavilion, because at the end of the day, one of the important things is the curators to see these things. So I guess my question to you is, how do you confront these issues of trying to let artists stay in the countries where they want to speak and have that a possibility when there are no collectors in Europe?
Okay, so that's a bit of the problem. There are collectors in a lot of those countries, but a Nigerian would collect Nigerian art, a Moroccan would collect Moroccan art, and they might not collect other international artists. And I think obviously there's a difference in belonging into a local collection and an international collection. Where you hear someone being part of the collection of one of the top 100 collector in the US. I think there's a huge difference. I think the problem with Africa, more than the collectors, is the institutions. There's no contemporary, museums or you don't have the chance to belong to a collection of a public institution in Africa. South Africa has a very strong national market, but it doesn't mean that the South African artists don't want to be bought by international collectors or be present in international collection. I think that for a gallery in Mali, 70 to 80% of their sales will be outside Mali for sure. But in South Africa, that ratio might be maybe inverse, or it will be probably 70% locally and 30% internationally. I think that the model that you just described, where artists had to leave, to go practice outside, make their own network of curators, institutions, collectors, was very true for a very long time. But you do have, artists who've made it, being and practicing in Africa. El Natsui is a case. His whole career was built in Africa, and there's few others that have the chance to now do that, on the continent. And they live there, they have their studio there, they have the chance to, obviously we talked about before at Dustin's studio about the internet and the connection and the ability to connect with the rest of the world, and to do residency, but then go back to their continent. So we see that model more and more, and we see more galleries opening up in different areas, in Africa that didn't have galleries before. So I think this model is changing, and we'll see more and more people being able to practice and have their studios in Africa and still be very connected to the international world. So I think, yes, it is, unfortunate that most of their collectors are based outside where they live. But I mean, at the end of the day, they have a local market. We wish it was stronger, but it doesn't mean the same. That's all what I'm saying. For an artist to belong to, a Malian collector versus, a very famous international, American collector, it doesn't weight the same for the moment.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience. Thanks all for being here tonight, and thank you for being in dialogue with me. I learned a lot.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, guys.